The year was 2042. The United States, once an unshakable global superpower, was reeling. For decades, a slow economic war had brewed between the US and China, culminating in a full-scale military invasion. The West Coast, from Seattle to San Diego, had fallen in a matter of months, leaving millions of Americans scrambling eastward in a desperate bid for safety. Now, the Rocky Mountains stood as the final barrier between the invaders and the heartland of the nation. The invasion began subtly, cloaked in the guise of economic dominance. China had spent decades solidifying its influence over critical industries worldwide. They manufactured 90% of global semiconductor chips, controlled over 75% of rare earth mineral exports, and dominated the green energy sector. When tensions escalated, they struck decisively. A cyberattack crippled the US financial system in the opening salvo. Stock markets crashed as banks and payment networks went offline. Within hours, supply chains for food, medicine, and energy ground to a halt. This chaos left major cities like Los Angeles and San Francisco vulnerable when waves of hypersonic missiles rained down on strategic targets, ports, military bases, and communication hubs. The Chinese military followed with an amphibious assault bolstered by AI-controlled drones and robotic ground units. Millions fled inland, overloading highways, collapsing infrastructure, and triggering a humanitarian crisis. Entire cities were abandoned, while refugee camps sprang up in deserts and plains. The Federal Emergency Management Agency FEMA, stretched thin, struggled to manage the largest mass migration in American history. In Washington, D.C., the federal government fractured. The president declared martial law, but with communication networks severely compromised, state governors began to act independently. Some states, like Texas, fortified their borders and prioritized local defense. Others sought alliances with neighboring regions. A shadow government formed in Denver, declaring the Rockies the new defensive line. Meanwhile, the U.S. military faced an existential crisis. Decades of outsourcing manufacturing left it dependent on foreign-made components. High-tech weapons systems sat idle, awaiting spare parts that would never arrive. Soldiers and volunteers were forced to rely on retrofitted Cold War-era equipment and improvised technologies. Yet, amidst this chaos, pockets of ingenuity emerged, with teams repurposing civilian technology to maintain some semblance of resistance. The dollar, once the world's reserve currency, was now worthless. China had been preparing for this moment by establishing the yuan as an alternative global standard. Nations dependent on Chinese trade quickly shifted allegiance, isolating the US further. Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies became the de facto medium of exchange, though their volatility and susceptibility to hacking made them unreliable. Millions of Americans resorted to barter systems, trading skills, food, and resources. Urban areas devolved into lawless zones where survival depended on local militias. The federal government's promises of recovery rang hollow, as every attempt to reestablish order was met with overwhelming resistance not just from the Chinese military but from disillusioned citizens as well. Underground economies flourished, creating a parallel system of trade and innovation that defied traditional governance. By January 2043, the Rocky Mountains became the nation's final defensive line. The natural barrier provided a geographic advantage, and the U.S. military concentrated its remaining forces there. Engineers transformed tunnels and peaks into fortresses, installing shields and experimental railguns salvaged from defunct research programs. Civilian militias joined the effort, armed with 3D-printed weapons and homemade drones. The Chinese army advanced eastward, relying on swarm AI to coordinate their forces. Robotic tanks and aerial drones swept through the Midwest, forcing the remnants of the U.S. military to adopt guerrilla tactics. American hackers, working from underground bunkers, launched counter-cyberattacks, disabling key Chinese systems and feeding disinformation to their networks. For every mile gained, China's forces paid dearly in blood and resources. By January 2043, the Rocky Mountains became the nation's final defensive line. The natural barrier provided a geographic advantage, and the U.S. military concentrated its remaining forces there. Engineers transformed tunnels and peaks into fortresses, installing shields and experimental railguns salvaged from defunct research programs. Civilian militias joined the effort, armed with 3D printed weapons and homemade drones. Despite the grim situation, whispers of resistance spread. Underground networks of scientists and engineers worked tirelessly to develop a quantum computing system capable of neutralizing China's AI dominance. In Colorado Springs, a secretive group known only as the Architects was rumored to be building a next-generation weapon, a hybrid of nanotechnology and biological engineering that could tip the balance of power. Meanwhile, ordinary citizens found ways to fight back. Farmers in Kansas used devices to disable drones attacking their fields. Hackers in abandoned Silicon Valley offices sent viruses into Chinese satellites, blinding their surveillance systems. Even in the face of annihilation, the American spirit, innovative, defiant, and unyielding, refused to die. In hidden labs beneath abandoned cities, teams of biologists experimented with genetically engineered crops that could grow in devastated soil, ensuring food supply for the resistance. Others worked on stealth drones capable of penetrating Chinese surveillance and delivering crucial intelligence to the Rockies defenders. On the morning of March 21, 2043, Chinese forces launched their first major assault on the Rockies. Thousands of drones darkened the skies, while mechanized infantry climbed treacherous mountain passes. But the defenders were ready. Railguns fired bolts of plasma, shattering entire squadrons of enemy drones. Guerrilla fighters ambushed convoys, using the terrain to their advantage. The battle raged for days, turning snow-capped peaks into scorched wastelands. Casualties mounted on both sides, but the defenders' resolve never wavered. The Rockies became a symbol of hope, a reminder that even in the darkest hour, resistance was possible. Reports emerged of a mysterious energy weapon deployed by the Architects, capable of disrupting entire formations of robotic soldiers. Though untested in large-scale combat, its debut in a critical skirmish turned the tide, buying precious time for the defenders to regroup. The outcome of the battle remains uncertain, but one thing is clear: the invasion has changed the fabric of the United States forever. The West Coast lies in ruin, the federal government's authority is fractured, and millions of displaced citizens struggle to rebuild their lives. Yet amidst the chaos, a fragile hope persists. The war has forced Americans to confront the consequences of decades of dependency, neglect, and division. Whether they can rise from the ashes to forge a new future remains to be seen. But in the shadow of the Rockies, the fight for that future continues. In the silence of the mountains, where snow mixes with ash, a nation's resolve is tested, and its spirit endures.